and I appreciate you tolerating me zooming in. I'm calling from Ithaca, New York this morning. So my name is Gerald McKinley. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine, also with an appointment in anthropology, and I'm part of the Schulich Interfaculty Program in Public Health. I'm currently away from Western this year as a Harkness Fellow, which is a fellowship hosted by the Commonwealth Fund, which gives me a year to spend a year anywhere in the U.S. thinking about a research question related to health and healthcare. So what I've taken on is the question of environmental policy. Most of the work that I do is with Indigenous communities across Ontario, with my strongest relationships being at Walpole Island First Nation. And it's a community that has done an excellent job of making sure that its voice is heard at the table when environmental conversations are taking place. So the project that I'm working on and that I've started working on is how do we increase the voice and participation and scoping of other communities that have been marginalized when we're developing environmental policy. And one of the things that I noticed very early is that it's not just a matter of asking them what their opinions are, because we've been doing that for many years. It's also a question of calibrating knowledge systems so that we move from kind of token participation, for lack of a better word, a very cynical way of looking at it, into kind of a meaningful calibration of knowledge systems. So let me start with this. This is a lovely picture of one of the waterfalls by my house here in Ithaca. And depending on who you are, you're going to see this as different things. Some of you are going to see the waterfall. Some of you, if you're interested in hydrology, are going to be interested in the flow of the water. Some of you are going to look at this and you're going to see the rock formations. And you're going to think about the geology of the area and how that might connect. If you fish, you might be interested in what fish is in that water. Apparently it's brown trout. There are plants growing on the side. So those of you who are interested in more the botany are going to be interested in the the play between light and shadow in the deep cavern and how that impacts the plant growth. And some of you might be engineers and you might see the little bridge at the top and think about the challenges of infrastructure across a chasm like this. And if you're into novel science information like I am, that little house you can see at the top apparently was Carl Sagan's house. So you might be interested in knowing that this is Carl Sagan's view when he was still alive and living in Ithaca. But essentially what I'm after here is thinking about and working in policy world that acknowledges that policy doesn't exist in a vacuum of pure evidence, right? We need to understand where and how perspectives both collide, connect, nearly miss, and other ways that they come together when we're trying to work across populations. And that's really what this project has become for me and what I'm continuing to try and figure out. So when we're thinking about complex adaptive systems, thinking about the challenge of, can we agree which parts are important or even what they do? So my research project has become very much trying to figure out how do we get people to work together within these ecologies where we have multiple ways of knowing what's just on the screen, but also, what's going on in the world, and do it in a safe way. So I've spent a big part of this year just trying to think about a methodology for doing this. And when I took on the fellowship, I told them that I was taking on a 15-year project and that I wasn't going to have the answer to them this year, and which the Commonwealth Fund was quite good with that. So what I've started working on is a relational map of discourses and how that ties into social production. And I'm drawing from, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm drawing on cognitive anthropology. I'm drawing on discourse analysis, and a number of other different areas. So what I've started doing is looking at the original discourse on a topic, and I'll explain what that means. I don't mean the original discourse in some, large metaphysical sense. I just mean I'm looking at different areas of discourse. For right now, I'm looking at the metaphors that people use when they're talking about something, and how that relates to the supporting co-text. And by co-text, what I mean is the language that's around the metaphor use, which helps us in understanding how someone is framing what they're trying to say, whether or not they're valuing something as good or bad. So that the metaphor is meant to guide us to understanding their perspective. Then mapping that out to connect it with a larger existing social discourse, and which is quite easy to do in the examples that I'm going to give you in a moment. Which then connects us to the history of that discourse. How does that then operate in a larger societal system, which can index who's in and who's out of a specific group, and who is the group that has the power to speak and who's being ignored, right? So we're getting back to that question of how do we get people, how do we include other voices? The next aspect is an area of language that is often overlooked, which is perlocution. And this comes from John Austin, who wrote about locution, which is just what's said, illocution, which is kind of what you mean by it, and then perlocution is what does it do in a grander sense, right? So I can say to you, sit down, and I can say to you in a very welcoming way. I can say, sit down, and what that's going to do is make you feel welcomed. But I can also say it to you in a way that can be threatening. Sit down. It's the exact same words, but I've had a different effect on you in how I've said it. Now, it's not just tone of voice that includes this. It's also what's said. But I'd argue it's the metaphors and the supporting text, how we frame what we're saying, that can have this effect, which then connects us to the social production aspect of the language. What does it actually do for us as a society? So I've started, because I'm not familiar with the US environmental policy system, I started by I spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. And it is a quagmire, to be honest, between state, federal, municipal, county. Everyone has their own rights and responsibilities. But one overarching act was the Environmental Protection Act, which recently was gutted under this Supreme Court case, which is Sackett versus the Environmental Protection Agency, which is one of the first what's called a major question cases, which is important, that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Essentially, the facts of the case: Michael and Chantal Sackett, they bought a house, Priest Lake, Idaho, which they started they didn't buy the house, they bought the land to start building a house, and they started backfilling the property. The Environmental Protection Agency showed up and told them to stop and reverse the damages because they had backfilled into a wetlands, which was adjacent to a ditch which connected to Priest Lake in Idaho, which was deemed waters of the United States. So under earlier interpretations of the Environmental Protection Act, the Clean Water Act, that water was deemed to be waters of the United States and therefore protected. So they were fined. It went through the court systems, and eventually the Supreme Court unanimously decided that their water was not part of the water of the United States. But there's a distinction in how the justices of the Supreme Court understood what was being argued, understood the purpose of the case, and understood the relationship between the Environmental Protection Agency, the Congress, and their role in making these decisions around the environment. And that's where the major question starts to come back in. So I'm going to start here with Justice Thomas's opinion on the case. So Thomas used, he writes very metaphorically. And so there was a lot to analyze. And my methodology, I'm an anthropologist, is very simple. I print off the case and I go at it with a highlighter. I identify the different metaphors that are in there. I look at the surrounding context. I look at the framing. I look at elements such as erasure, so how groups like the Environmental Protection Agency are erased and replaced just with words like the agency, or how individuals are erased or increased in presence. So Thomas, one of the first metaphors he uses is confines, right, and to lock up, and the surrounding co-text he uses here in order to help us understand what he means by this, because someone can be confined justly or unjustly. He's using phrases like correctly holds, ordinary parlance, limited reach. And what he's after here is talking about how important it is for the court to confine the Environmental Protection Agency so it doesn't overstep its bounds. And this connects with some of the other metaphors that he uses in his general language. And he really tries to get back to what the original meaning of the Constitution was from his own perspective. Now, how this ties into a larger discourse is that he connects it to the discourse that the government is too big and needs to have limits put upon it, which speaks to a very specific, generally conservative aspect of American society, right? And what he does here in the signaling is that he signals to small government advocates that he's on their side, and that he has the backing of the court at this time because of the majority that we understand was put in there by Trump. Now, the social production aspect of this is that reifies the perspective that it's correct to limit government before it becomes a tyrant, right? So you get this reification of an existing discourse that the government is too big and too powerful and it needs to step back. An opposite opinion, and this is someone who agreed with the decision that Sackett's land was not part of the United States, but the waters of the United States, but they completely disagreed on what the purpose of the case was, even though it was the same information and the same trial. Was Justice Kagan, who was appointed by Barack Obama. And they used the metaphor of thumb on the scale, which is a really interesting one, because they were speaking directly against the court and using co-text such as judicially manufactured and wrong. So they're talking about how, and the specific phrase was that the court had its thumb on the scale for landowners. So they were essentially saying that the Supreme Court of the United States was one that was now cheating the system for landowners, which is exactly what the Clean Water Act was meant to prevent. So how this ties into a larger discourse, it's a different one, which is one that is growing as we head towards an election here in the US, is that the Supreme Court is serving special interests, and it has been appointed to serve specific special interests. What this does then, what the perlocution there is it damages the reputation of the Supreme Court, and signifies to people who are uncomfortable with some of the decisions that the court has been making, that they're correct in thinking about that, right? So it signals a breakdown of the U.S. democratic system, and specifically, Kagan calls out the major question doctrine, which is in the U.S. it has replaced Chevron, which in the Chevron doctrine, Congress would defer its authority to the experts. So the Environmental Protection Agency knows more about the environment than the local congressperson, so that they therefore would make the decisions. Major question shifts that and says that if it's a major question, only the Supreme Court should make that decision. So it's essentially a breaking down and removing of democracy, really, in the U.S. and a fundamental shift in their system, right? So again, we're seeing the same case, and we're seeing multiple perspectives on it. And just realizing that I've got only a couple of minutes left here, I'm left with this question of so what, right? So what? We don't agree on what something means. But also the problem is now that it's becoming more important that we have to. And when we enter into negotiations and we're trying to find common ground with people, it's better to find, and it's better to understand where they're coming from than to just argue, right? Because we'll be more productive that way. And one of the things that I'm looking at and thinking about is an idea that's called polycentric governance. which is essentially, rather than having one government agency make the decisions, we include all stakeholders. So landowners, local farmers, municipalities, local First Nations, anyone that's on the ground that's going to be impacted by something then has a voice in it. It's a very cumbersome system. And it's one that Nebraska has used quite effectively in its water governance systems. But it's dependent upon information and clarity of that information. So what I'm after with this mapping of these discourses into a larger system and finding their social connections is a way of bringing that information together for us. And then how do we, and this is the $1 million question for my research project that's going to take up the next 14 years, is how do we start to meaningfully calibrate those understandings in a way that doesn't degrade anyone's perspective, but also makes it possible for people to work better together, because the environment is very much in crisis. And dealing with the question of how do we make this more than an academic project. Right, I'm an applied anthropologist. I go out and I do these things. How do we make sure that the work that we do is meaningful to the populations that we support? So I will end there, just over 15 minutes. And if there's any question, if there's time for questions, I'm not sure.